Today I'm talking to Oliver Miles, who's a former British ambassador to Libya. We're going to be talking about the situation in the country at the moment, the West's response to it and how it might unfold. Oliver Miles, thank you very much for talking to RT. Now, isn't the West's response to the situation in Libya dangerously close to what we saw before the invasion of Iraq? I'm thinking of this proposed no-fly zone, these claims that we've heard that Gaddafi has chemical weapons, and also this talk around the world of military intervention.
Well, there is a parallel, but I think there are some important differences, and the one I think I'd focus on is that although there's been some rather bellicose talk from both London and Washington and Paris, what they've actually done is go to the Security Council straight away, and they got full agreement in the Security Council, unanimous support for a resolution which didn't refer at all to military action or anything of that kind. So it's not a close parallel, I don't think.
Surely Britain's at least partially responsible for what's going on in Libya and what we saw in Egypt previously. After all, London did support these regimes for as long as it suited it.
Well, I think that's a bit much, actually. I mean, the British press take that view. The British press are always going on about, the meeting in the desert between Tony Blair and Gaddafi. And it's true, they did meet in the desert and they did a deal, and it was a very useful deal for us. But after all, Sarkozy and Berlusconi and Condi Rice and Mr. Putin and everybody else have all done deals with Libya. So there's nothing especially British about it. The world has been doing business with Libya, and in my opinion, quite right too. Because after all, Libya has oil, which we need. The world market needs it, and Libya needs from the world practically everything else, from aeroplanes to drains, and we're there selling them. And when I say we, it's not the West or Britain or Europe, it's everybody. China, Taiwan, Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, you name it, they're all there. Everybody's there, and quite right too.
We've recently seen a diplomatic mission to Benghazi that ended in the capture of an SAS team. Is the UK actively trying to engage with the rebels? Well,
I hope so. Don't ask me too much about that episode, because I think it's rather embarrassing. I don't think it was British diplomacy at its best, to be frank, and I've said that to the British media as well. But yes, we should be talking to the rebels. I think it's a difficult thing to do. It's not unique. There have been plenty of situations. Indeed, it's in a way parallel to the situation in Afghanistan, where we should be talking to the people we're fighting against. And in Libya, we're not fighting against anybody, but we should be talking to the different parties. We are talking to Gaddafi's people. William Hague said the other day that he personally was on the telephone to Moussa Koussa, the Libyan foreign minister, who was one of Gaddafi's close supporters. And I think we've also got to reach out to the others. It's a difficult thing to do, firstly because Tripoli won't want us to do it, of course, and they'll put a spoke in the wheel if they can. And secondly, because the situation is still very disorganized. There isn't a military command structure, there isn't a political structure. There's the beginnings of a political structure, but nothing that purports to be a state yet.
We now know that SAS mission was approved by Foreign Secretary William Hague. Was the sending of that team of soldiers illegal or just inept?
Illegal. I'm sure it was illegal under Libyan law, yes. It's, under most people's law, it's illegal to land a helicopter in the middle of somebody else's country full of armed men. Yes, I think it certainly was illegal. But on the other hand, there's a lot going on in Libya at the moment that you might describe as illegal. That's the nature of civil conflict, isn't it?
We talked about the British and the French going to the UN Security Council. How likely is it, do you think, that NATO will approve some kind of military intervention in Libya? And if they don't, do you think that the UK and the US will go in anyway?
As things are at the moment, I think it's most unlikely. Particularly because Turkey, which is an important member of NATO, is dead against intervention. I think that there'll be others as well, probably, but Turkey has already shown its hand, so to speak. I think that as a matter of fact, I don't believe anyone at the moment is really pushing for military intervention. There's been a lot of talk of a no-fly zone, and people are gradually coming to realise that a no-fly zone, which sounds a rather innocent form of intervention, actually involves a lot of military intervention. Because the first thing you have to do if you have a no-fly zone is make sure that you've eliminated the effective anti-aircraft defences of Libya. Well, I guess Libya is absolutely full of anti-aircraft missiles. There must be hundreds and thousands of them. They've been accumulating them for the last 40 years. How many of them actually would go off if they pulled the trigger is another matter. I don't suppose they know that themselves. But they're all over the place. So eliminating them would be a big job.
So, in fact, a no-fly zone does constitute some form of military intervention?
Oh, absolutely, yes. No doubt at all. And I think it's disproportionate for the moment, because why do you have a no-fly zone? Because Gaddafi has an air force, and the fear is that he might use it effectively, and that the rebels would have no answer to it, and there would be a humanitarian disaster. Well, that's all possible, but it hasn't happened yet. And what's happened so far is that the Air Force has made a rather pathetic showing. Two of the aircraft promptly defected to Malta rather than bomb their own side. We've heard reports of bombing. All of the bombs seem to have missed whatever they were meant to hit.
Deliberately, you think?
Well, who knows? Who knows? And there have been stories of attacks right from the beginning of the conflict in Libya. There have been stories of attacks on civilian populations, but I don't know of a single authenticated case. I think we've all probably had the experience. I've done it myself. All the media correspondents are telephoning anyone they can find in Libya, and the story you get from everybody is, well, right here where I am, there's some shooting, and it sounds nasty, but I'm not going outside to look. And yes, I have heard stories of bombs, but none of them in my area. That seems to be the general picture. So I don't believe it, really. I think it's disproportionate, therefore, at the moment, to talk about a no-fly zone, and that's why both the British and the Americans have been talking about being ready. And there's nothing wrong with telling your military to be ready for a contingency. That's a different matter.
And what are the chances, do you think, that if NATO and other countries don't OK it, the US and the UK go ahead and do it anyway?
I think most unlikely. Most unlikely. It will be a big job, and we are already pretty heavily involved. We've got enough on our plate with Afghanistan. The Americans have got enough on their plate with Iraq and Afghanistan. I think it's most unlikely. You can never completely rule these things out, but I don't see it.
And let's talk a bit about Libya's relationship directly with the UK. We hear that a lot of Libya's oil wealth is invested through London. Those assets have now been frozen, but could they be used as a bargaining chip with Gaddafi?
I suspect, from what I've heard so far, that it's a blunt instrument. And I'm one of the things I'm unhappy about is that although, as I said at the beginning, I'm glad that we went to the Security Council, and I think it was the right thing to do, and we got this unanimous decision from the Security Council. I think when you start to look at the small print of the decision, it's actually not very helpful. For example, one of our ministers, Liam Fox, said last week, and I think he was quite right, that the best solution to this problem would be for Gaddafi to leave. Well, if one takes that view, why does the UN pass a law which says that no country can accept him, and that wherever he goes he's going to be subject to prosecution? Surely we shouldn't have said that. Well, if you look very carefully at the UN resolution, you find that in the small print there's a clause which says that this ban on travel can actually be lifted by the Security Council in appropriate cases. So, if Gaddafi was to write an application in triplicate and send it to New York, after a lot of time, the lawyers might come up with a solution. But that's not what's going to happen. If he decides to go, he'll go. What we should have done is offer him a free ticket to Zimbabwe, a one-way. So
you're saying that even though everybody seems to want him to leave, Gaddafi is now actually trapped in Libya? Well, of course, the Africans, for example, and I don't know whether it's the Africans, but it's the obvious place to think of, won't necessarily follow the UN rules. If he arrives with a bag of gold and says, I want to stay in your country, he'll probably be allowed to do so. Another thing that has been in the press a lot recently is concerning two of Gaddafi's sons who were educated in British universities, which in turn received generous donations from them. Do you think that will prompt the UK to now look more closely at who it allows to come and study in this country and how they're being funded? I sincerely hope not. I'm really worried about the media reaction to this particular case. And what is worrying to me is that, although I can't be sure, in fact I have no real basis for what I'm going to say, but I'll say it anyway, knowing what I do of Saif al-Islam's lifestyle and how full his life has been, his curriculum vitae so far, I simply don't understand how he could possibly have spent 2 or 3 or 4 years full-time acquiring a genuine doctorate at the London School of Economics, which after all is one of our prestige universities. To get a doctorate at the LSE is no joke. I'm not saying he's not clever enough, he may well be clever enough, but how did he do it in the time? I just don't believe it. So I think it's fishy. So that's
I think, a good reason for the director of the London School of Economics to resign, which he's done. And I applaud him for it. I think it's the honourable thing to do. Well, clearly he had no, or most unlikely that he had any direct hand in the business, but it's his responsibility. However, he then went on to say that he apologised for a wrong judgment in that he'd been to Libya and talked about cooperation between the London School of Economics and Libya, and I don't agree with that at all. I think he was quite right to do that, and he shouldn't apologise for it. And I'm worried that other British universities and other universities around the world which have had links with Libya may now feel that they have to back off. They shouldn't, because the logic of that is they would back off not just from Libya but from everywhere else. They would back off, dare I say it, from Russia, they would back off from Algeria, they would back off from Saudi Arabia, they would back off from China, where would it stop? Where would it stop? Now, I think it's in everybody's interest that Britain, for example, let's stick with Britain for a moment, should be teaching students from all over the world. It's in everybody's advantage, our advantage, their advantage. I hope it doesn't stop.
Do you think that Colonel Gaddafi has the support of the majority of his people and the loyalty of the army, as he says he does?
I think that there's a strong current of freedom and liberation opening up, flowing from Egypt and Tunisia, which Libyans, of course, feel very close to. And I think there's a strong feeling that we've had enough and that Gaddafi has got to go. But how wide that goes and why he's able to keep so many people demonstrating for him in the streets of Tripoli, I'm afraid I can't really answer. To some extent it's done by money. He pays people to demonstrate for him. But it's also done by loyalty, and it's very difficult to distinguish the two.
Gaddafi continues to cling on to power. What do you think would happen to the UK's relationship with Libya if he did manage to stay as leader?
I think it'll be very difficult, both for the UK and for the rest of the world. Of course, he'll be in a weak position, but if he's in a weak position, he'll probably lash out in some unpleasant, dangerous way. I mean, it's like, you know, if you're hunting a bear, it's better to shoot it dead or not shoot it at all, because if you half shoot it, then you've got a problem on your hands, and I'm afraid that's the situation we will end up with unless he goes. So it's very difficult to see what the future will hold. What are we going to do about these sanctions? When are they going to be lifted? Or is it going to be frozen forever, in which case, presumably, that means the world does without Libyan oil. Why? Why should the world do without Libyan oil? We need the oil, they need the money. I say the Libyan people need the money. Of course, I can see why Gaddafi has got to be stopped, but in the long term, freezing Libya out is cruel, wrong.
Oliver Miles, thank you very much.
Thank you.